I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I am Dean Detloff, your co-host as usual.
And I'm Matt Bernico, your other co-host, also as usual. We're both still here, just like always.
That's like always, but what is different this time around is it is the Advent week of peace. Last week it was hope, this week it's peace. Keeping it fresh. I saw some discourse on Twitter the other day that from some crabby liturgists who were like, this whole hope, peace, joy, love business, that's new stuff, and we shouldn't do it because it's too new. And my hottest take right now is I disagree. I think candles can have lots of meanings and we'll all be just fine. And I think saying peace is one meaning for this week is a good one, and that's what we're talking about on this podcast. That's the business as unusual, I guess.
How old is this practice now? How new is new? Because for some liturgists, it's it's only 500 years old.
Right. No, this person I'm not going to say who it was.
Please,
but
yeah.
It won't take you long to find out if you really care. But they said that it was 20 years old. And I know that that's not true because I am more than 20 years old. And I heard it growing up as a kid in the Catholic Church. So who could say? Maybe they just made it up when I was a kid and I got lucky, but it's been around. I mean, whatever. Maybe it's 100 years old or something. Who could say? But who cares?
Listen,
I'm here to tell you who cares.
Even if it's 5 years old, I don't care because we need something to organize our podcast around for a few weeks. I'm going to take this.
Exactly.
It's fine. It's an ancient tradition. I don't care. It doesn't matter.
It's either this or it's I don't know, heaven and hell or something. Some weird ancient Advent week meaning. And I don't know, there's a place for that, but it is not here.
That's right. Okay, so it's the week of peace. Here we are, and I don't care how old it is, but we're doing it. Okay, so in this episode, we're gonna think through peace, just like we did last week. We did hope. Now we're doing it with peace. It's gonna be great. This week we're gonna get into it and talk about peace as kind of a political idea. Peace on earth, goodwill towards all people. It's in the Bible, and we love it. It's in the Bible. It's in Charlie Brown. Those are the two canonical sources for us, I think, and those things are great. But it's not just us celebrating, it's also the United States government. That's right, folks. To mark the occasion of the Peace Week of Advent, the House of Representatives decided they were going to pass a $778 billion Pentagon budget. That's right. You heard that right. $778 billion. That is exactly $37 billion more than they did last year.
That's too many.
It's too many billions. It's more than they did last year. And also it had some outrageous bipartisan support. A CNN article reports that it had 363 yes votes to 70 no votes. I don't know who those 70 people are, but I like them. I think they're great. Those 70 people know what they're doing.
They're great unless they're libertarians, in which case they're confused.
Exactly. They a broken clock is right 2 times a day, and I guess they might fall into that category. But listen, people have been arguing nonstop about this, the Build Back Better plan, and trying to get bipartisan support for these things. But look, they've achieved it. if only building infrastructure and giving people sort of a basic social safety net was as popular as buying bombs and stuff, we'd be in such a better place.
Yeah, we really would. $778 billion is a number that is hard for me to think about. And I'm not a math person. I don't have a numbers brain. So I always try to like take these big numbers and think of other ways of thinking about them, just so that I can like get my head around
yeah.
how big they really are. So here's my fun exercise I like to do. There are 1,000 millions in 1 billion, and there are 1,000 thousands in 1 million. So 778 billion is like a ton of thousands. That's how I like to think about it. It feels way bigger if I just think of it as a lot of $1,000 bills stacked up.
That's great. That's very helpful.
Thousands of millions of thousands.
That is so many dollars, and I don't like it. Okay, but I'm sure there's a skeptical listener out there who's thinking, yeah, Matt and Dean, but there's probably something good that this whole big boatload, this whole several boatloads of money did. And let me tell you what it did. I can tell you exactly. Well, I can tell you what a news article told me. If you want to believe the liberal news, I guess this is
the mainstream media.
The mainstream media. If you want to believe the mainstream media, this is what it does. So this is from an article from CNN, kind of recounting what's going on with this bill. The final version of the bill, which leadership from both chambers have agreed, contains changes to how sexual assault and harassment are prosecuted and handled in the military. See, very good. That's great. A 2.7 pay increase for military service members and Defense Department civilian employees. Great, higher wages. And 300 million in military aid to the to the Ukrainian Security Assistance Initiative. So that's cool. Got to arm some other people, really important. Apart from that, some of the other things it goes to is a study and like funding for quote anomalous health incidents, more colloquially known as Havana Syndrome. The bill authorizes the president to appoint a senior official to lead a whole of government effort to address incidents. The summary states the bill also creates a Department of Defense cross-functional team to coordinate the Pentagon's response to health incidents like Havana Syndrome. Let's see. So there's also some stuff in there too about unidentified. What is it called? They're not UFOs anymore, Dean. What's the phrase?
Yeah, they're not UFOs. The phrase now is unidentified aerial phenomena, AEPs.
Okay. So
or UAPs.
UAPs, unidentified aerial
Palians.
Palians. That's great. So okay, listen, it's not all just missiles. It's just not all tanks. It's also to fund. It's also to arm Ukraine. It's also to, create a whole piece of government infrastructure about Havana Syndrome. And it's also a look for aliens. And I think some of that's probably fine. Just kidding.
It's so interesting actually to read the way that like CNN reports on it, for example, because the leading line is about sexual assault and harassment in the military, and it's bad for sure. But it's framed in this kind of liberal way that kind of maybe helps you get a window into the bipartisan framing of this too, because anytime you tell a Republican you want to raise the military budget, it makes sense that they would be salivating over it. But Democrats are super enthusiastic about doing this as well. I mean, it's not like a huge debate usually for Democrats either. And it's because they sort of frame the budget increases in these like progressive terms or something, leaving out that, what did we say the number was? It's $778 billion. My guess is changes to the sexual assault and harassment prosecution in the military are probably a pretty small fraction of that gigantic budget. Not to dismiss it or downplay it. I mean, sexual assault and harassment is extremely bad in the military, but just to say, like, one thing that CNN is not going to report on is like how we're actually going to be holding the military accountable for all that money, because like we won't we won't do that. Nobody cares really what the breakdown of that money is, and I think that is huge, right? Like every dollar has to be accounted for if there's like a social assistance program, but the Pentagon is like a gigantic, vast black hole of funding that Democrats and Republicans just kind of keep throwing taxpayer dollars into every year.
It's true. And what is also astounding to me is that, okay, 778 billion, but that is 37 billion dollars higher than it was last year. And like the United States is in one less war than they were last year as well. So it's just like, what is even happening?
And in worse economic straits than, it has been historically. So
it's true. I mean, a lot going on there. Just like, I guess it tells you some things about priorities for the country and for politicians and stuff, right? Like this is this is a bill that was passed with like very little fanfare, right? Like nobody even probably remembers it. I mean, it was on the lamestream media for a hot second, and now it's over, and like whatever, nobody even cares. It's
Yeah.
not
Also,
even a conversation.
people, yeah, I think too, like, people forget exactly how bizarre, like how bloated the military budget is. I mean, we'll get to it in a minute. The fact that yes, of course, the United States shouldn't have a military at all. It's a big imperialist monster, and so on and so forth. But like, even in the military that it has, like the amount of waste that is just spent. You know, I'm not calling for like a fiscally responsible military or anything, but just sort of saying like it's absurd how much waste happens in the military. There's a great documentary called "Do Not Resist" from like 2016 or something, so it's kind of old now, but it's all about the militarization of U.S. police, and one of the really wild parts of it is like they talk briefly about the pipeline of decommissioned and completely unused military vehicles that just get donated to local police departments. So it's like, you know, some police department in like rural Michigan will suddenly get like an extremely like absurd aquatic vehicle or like amphibious vehicle that they just like keep in a garage. And there's a really fascinating piece of footage where there's a local police chief in one of these kind of tiny fiefdoms just driving around in like a gigantic decommissioned tank for literally no reason.
Yeah.
And like the documentarian's like, what would you use something like this for? And they're like, yeah, I don't know, like for drug busts or something. And they show somebody like driving it up to like, you know, bully someone who uses marijuana essentially. So it's like, you know, the overfunding of the military is bad for so many reasons. And also it has these like cascading effects into civilian life that are just extremely awful.
You know, before I moved to the big city, and I lived in a really small town, kind of out in the middle of nowhere, but it was exactly that case. We had a decommissioned Humvee that was painted
Right.
like sort of like the desert camouflage pattern, and all it did was it just sat in the it sat in the parking lot of the police department, and like it never was driven. It was always in the same parking spot every day. So it's just like, I don't know. I mean, you know, it's just like it's so absurd at these levels. It's hard to look at and not just think of it as such a laughably silly thing.
Yeah.
But I mean, like you said, I mean, there's a reason that the United States invests in this kind of thing. It's because, you know, it is an imperialist power, because it does care about military might above all things, and you know, it's awful, but it does exist, I guess. So the whole thing, the whole reason we're kind of pulling this out though is just like, I don't know, what an absurd thing to happen during this Advent time of year. I'm sure that bipartisan support came from a large chunk of Christians in the legislature. They probably didn't think twice about it. Or in some ways, they probably thought they were doing something peaceful if they really thought about it in a sort of twisted kind of way. But we're bringing it here to you because it's funny, it's weird, and it makes you say, huh? That's what a good podcast does.
It's funny in that way where you're like, this is so depressing. I guess I have to laugh at how absurd it is.
That's right. That's right.
But yeah, I mean, it is important to sort of mark, though, that it's a fundamental contradiction with the Advent Week of Peace, right? Trying to kind of get ourselves in headspace to think about the coming of the Prince of Peace and all those kinds of big themes, peace on earth, goodwill toward human beings, etc., the good Charlie Brown message. To be preparing for that season, and then also to have like people in Congress who are also going to church preparing for that season, and they're like passing, you know, gigantic budgets literally for funding killing other people and all kinds of nasty stuff. It's an important contradiction. So it's a good excuse. It's a good way for us to maybe dig a little bit into the concept of peace. We can put on our lefty Christian-y thinking caps again and see what kind of tools we can borrow and come up with. I think, you know, we'll probably trod a lot of ground we've talked about on this podcast before. We've talked about complicating pacifism, for example, on this podcast in the past. We'll keep doing that. We've talked about sort of the social conditions for peace before, and we'll do that too. But it's always good to kind of rehearse this stuff, especially when we have an excuse, a liturgical excuse to do so, despite what the stuff you liturgists have to say.
That's right. Maybe this time it'll be better than last time. You never know.
Probably. I'm older, wiser, more peaceful.
One more Advent under our belts. That much more spiritual formation to get it right.
That's right.
Okay, so if you listened to our podcast before, you know that we have some big hot takes and opinions about pacifism and nonviolence and violence, all of these types of concepts. They're a big thing for us. We've talked about them, I don't know, since the very beginning of our podcast, I would imagine. Let's see. It's not that we think that violence is good, or it's somehow desirable in some kind of like weird romantic Marxist kind of way, because it's not. Violence is bad, and I'm here to say it. I'm here to say this very controversial opinion on our podcast. I don't think violence is good. It sucks. Okay, but pacifism within the like sort of tradition of Christian pacifism, which we can talk about more deeply in maybe a few minutes, is maybe not the best descriptor or best framework or most robust theory for talking about violence in the way that it actually works. In the Bible, you get all kinds of things about peacemaking and violence. If you live by the sword, you die by the sword. If someone hits you, you should turn the other cheek. In the Sermon on the Mount, you got all kinds of great stuff about blessed are the peacemakers. It's all in there, and it's great. I think there's a lot of really good ideas. I think this is spun out in Christianity in some different ways, but in the end, I think what we have to kind of confront is that I think pacifism is cool and has a lot of great ideas, but it it doesn't really help us understand the ways that violence exists structurally. Um, or if it does, its answer to it is kind of lackluster. It's lacking something, I guess, a bit. So, something like getting evicted from your house, that's violence, I would say. Being thrown out into the street and you can't live in the place where your family has lived for a while, that is pretty violent, I would say. Or like wage theft, I think that's also pretty violent, right? Your boss can steal the wages that you've earned in one way or another and make sure you don't get paid them. That is violence, right? Forcing somebody to live in poverty, it's as violent as it gets. I don't know. Like, of
Which
course.
a lot of pacifists would say that too, right?
Yeah.
They would be able to recognize that as a violence, which is a good thing.
Totally. Yeah.
But yeah, their
I,
responses may be different than some others.
That's right. Yeah. And I mean, I don't want to speak for pacifism as a whole because I think it's a pretty diverse type of thinking, but there is a certain type of thinking in pacifism where it's like, okay, well, I mean, you should reject all violence. And I think when you think of it that way, rejecting violence is kind of difficult, like at the structural level. Like, how do you reject wage theft? Can you actually do that in a way that is non-violent, or is organizing a union, is that somehow violent also? And probably not. But all that to say, there's like a certain slipperiness of terms when it really gets into thinking about violence structurally, and the either violence or non-violence dichotomy, it really breaks down and becomes quite complicated. So I think something that Dean and I do a lot, or at least something we talk about quite a bit, is like the ways that Christian pacifists do this well and don't do this very well. And I think there's, I think Dean and I are both people who are really formed and influenced by Christian pacifism as like a particular type of idea. Um, but I think we also have our own struggles with it. So Dean, let's like wade into that conversation a bit here. When we're talking about Christian pacifism, what kind of trends are we talking about? Who are we talking about? Like, what's going on with that whole milieu?
Yeah, I think it might be easy to sort of break it down into there is a sophisticated form of pacifism that I have a ton of respect for, even if I have some kind of, I don't know, differences of commitments, I guess is maybe the best way of putting it. And then there's also a form of pacifism that I think is kind of a, I don't know, like a more sort of adolescent excuse or like a domestication of that more radical and sophisticated approach. So let me start with the one I don't like first, and that way I can end on a positive note.
Yeah.
The one I don't like is a kind of commitment to Christian nonviolence that sounds really radical rhetorically, right? It'll be like, as a follower of Jesus Christ, I reject all forms of violence. And that sometimes spins itself out into these kind of weird statements where like a pastor or a theologian might say something like, Jesus wasn't left or right or center or anything like that. Jesus was just nonviolent, and like that's all there is to say about it. And this oftentimes, I can kind of understand where the impulse comes from, but it doesn't allow us to actually see the important differences that do actually exist among different political options or strategies or groups that we might consider. And it sort of sidesteps the question rather than putting it in a new light, which is, I think, what a lot of these kinds of pacifists are trying to do. So, one example, I will pick on him because he's famous. Brian Zond, a guy, a pastor, a writer, a person in the world. He has this kind of take, and this is the person I sort of have in mind, maybe as one poster child, I guess. And I'm thinking of this one Twitter exchange that he had a long time ago with a number of folks where he had said in his church there are both undocumented immigrants and ICE officers. And, like, isn't that a picture of the kind of nonviolent way of Jesus to sort of, bring a community together where these people can pursue whatever it means to follow Jesus in the same place? And it's like, well, not exactly, right? Because there's a structural violence that is basically being baptized when these two people are kind of in the same space without the same kind of uncomfortability. So just to sort of maybe put one example to it. So that's the kind I don't like. I don't like it because I think it's a bit lazy. I think it hides behind a radical rhetoric that is not followed by any radical actions or politics. But there's a good form of Christian pacifism that I have a lot of respect for. I think the Christian peace movement is one of the biggest gifts that Christians in the US and Canada have given to the world. So by that I mean Christians like Daniel and Philip Berrigan, right? Or Dorothy Day, these Christians who are kind of willing to, because of this maximal demand of total nonviolence, like they will steal Vietnam draft documents and burn them in the street, right? And then they'll go to jail for that. Or even people like Martin Luther King, right? People who have taken a nonviolent strategy and because of their commitment have tried to get gains with, different varying degrees of success and so on. So I have a lot of respect for that kind of pacifism. I think most recently, I've been thinking a lot about Christian Peacemaker teams, especially because Matt and I went to a rally that was in part organized by them here in Toronto for Wet'suwet'en Solidarity. And Christian Peacemaker Teams is a really cool organization. They are a nonviolent organization, but everyone I talk to who's part of CPT has a really nuanced opinion about how they relate to violent situations. So, for instance, they accompany people in places like Palestine or in Colombia and here in Canada in Wet'suwet'en territory and so on. And when things do get violent in those places, they don't sort of wag their finger at, like, the oppressed. They don't wag their finger at Palestinians throwing rocks or something like that. Instead, they say, well, we are nonviolent, and in our capacity, what happens in those situations is we observe what happens, we try to sort of provide a truthful witness, an account of what's happening, and so on. But they don't see their position as, like, moralizing against people who are oppressed. And that is a position I can really get behind, and something that, it just is the case that sort of pacifist commitment is actually what draws them into that more deep analysis of, like, structural violence that they're showing up for and so on. So I have a lot of time for that. Maybe we can talk about how to complicate it later, but I'll end on the positive note. Those are the good pacifists. The ones who are like, they don't turn their pacifism into like a big moral badge that they can use or like a kind of rhetorical radicalism, but it's something that really draws them into the struggle.
Yeah, I think that's about right. I mean, I was, when I was an evangelical, I think I was really motivated by the idea of Christian pacifism, but it was definitely not that one. Maybe because I didn't know that it existed, but it was definitely like the cool rhetoric and like seeming very radical. But when you get down to it, I mean, it gets very complicated and very hard. And Christian peacemaker teams are such a great example of like what it looks like to be really committed to being with people and being nonviolent and stuff. I think that's really a great example. Well, there are also all kinds of, I think, very interesting characters from the history of sort of like, I don't know, like more radical types of Christianity. Um, we can talk about a lot of them, I think, like the Berrigans and, like Leo Tolstoy, I guess. Leo Tolstoy is a weird character, though. I don't know.
Not as cool.
Definitely not as cool, that's for sure. But the one person that I have learned a little bit about this past year, who I think is actually very interesting on this particular topic, is Benjamin Leigh. Okay, so you might remember a while back we did an episode with a guy named Marcus Rediker, who is a historian. He wrote a book about Benjamin Leigh. And I don't know, a really fascinating character. I think that it would be great for more Christians to learn about this person, especially in this particular time. I think in 2021, it's exactly the time to learn about Benjamin Leigh again. Um, so Benjamin Leigh was a Quaker. He was born in 1682, and then he died in like 1759. So, the time period is quite different. The context is quite different. Um, sort of not even a, a United States citizen if you think about it. But he was born in England. He lived life there as a Quaker, and eh, he was really influenced by like a lot of the earlier Quakers who had, I think, more of a radical bent to them than maybe some of the Quakers of his time. And in that time in England, he was really inspired by that, but ended up being like really ostracized by the larger community for not like having the same sort of radical streak as he did. He and his wife ended up moving to Barbados, and he became like extremely radicalized there against slavery. I mean, he was against slavery for sure in England, but like in Barbados, I guess it was sort of a whole nother story. The culture of slavery was, I guess, different and far more brutal. I mean, slavery is always brutal, so I don't know. That's saying something, I suppose. But anyways, he and his wife, like, they decided that they were going to be abolitionists, that they were going to do whatever they could to sort of, I don't know, to like, I guess, to be with the enslaved people in Barbados, and like it ended up kind of driving them away from it, away from Barbados because they like, I don't know, they were facing persecution as well, just like such a kind of intense thing to live through. So they moved to the United States and decided they were going to be Quakers there. And and just like in England, just like in Barbados, and then just like the United States, their like abolitionism really got them into a lot of trouble with their local Quaker meetings. They kept getting tossed out. Everyone was constantly mad at them. Benjamin Leigh got the worst of it, like kind of some physical abuse. But, like, he continually put his life on the line for something that he, like, really believed in, like the abolition of slavery, which is good, I guess, but, like, a tough thing to do when your entire community is, like, clearly hates your guts because of it. But I think what's really interesting about Benjamin Leigh, so, I mean, he's an abolitionist, I think that's super fascinating, and more to say there. I mean, he thinks that, it's absurd for humans to own other humans. I mean, and I agree. But Benjamin Leigh was even kind of radicalized even a bit more. He ended up being sort of a vegetarian for the same reason that like being brutal towards another creature was just like not something that he kind of could square away within his brain. But then like so he's an abolitionist, he's a vegetarian, but then it kind of bled out into all these other parts of his life where he kind of let he let the pacifism, the sort of practice of pacifism, like really consume his life in a fascinating way. Where in Barbados he witnessed slaves picking sugar and like kind of processing sugar, and he saw them, they would get like whipped or beaten for doing, I don't know, whatever, something wrong, and like their blood would mix with the sugar, and that was like a point in his life where then he was like completely anti-sugar. He wouldn't take sugar in his tea or whatever, and like that was a big thing that people always questioned him about, like when he would go to dinner parties. He ended up like even eschewing sort of like the, I don't know, even like extremely normative types of comfort, like living in a house. He and his wife both decided that they were going to live in a cave, so they did. Um, so radical vegetarians who are against sugar, who live in a cave, who are also abolitionists. Then on top of that, if all of those things wouldn't make him unpopular enough, he did these sort of like really wild and interesting acts of political theater in these Quaker meeting houses. There's really recently, just like a few weeks ago, a graphic novel about Benjamin Leigh came out, and the opening pages are him in a Quaker meeting house, and he's stabbing a Bible with a sword, and then like all of this like all of this like fake blood comes out. It's like berry juice, but it's like the Bible starts oozing out blood, and then he's telling everybody the evils of slave owning, and that makes you an apostate of Quakerism and stuff. There's some other great stuff too where, man, where Benjamin Leigh, there's like the scene in the graphic novel I think is really perfectly drawn and illustrated. But Benjamin Leigh is walking in the snow, and he doesn't have he has only one shoe on, and his other foot is just barefoot. And someone's like, Benjamin Leigh, what are you doing? It's snowing outside. And he's like, well, you have slaves in your field that are in the same dress as me and whatever. And this is, like, I'm only showing you what you put them through or something. And just like some really great moments where he was like very in your face to other people about sort of like the brutality that they're perpetrating in their own life. Anyways, all that to say, Benjamin Leigh I think is a really interesting example of pacifism because it's not just sort of like um it's not someone who's just thinking about it in terms of like a lifestyle or something. Like it's not like it's not like, whatever, Jesus is a pacifist and like it doesn't really matter. You should just be nonviolent. It's like someone who's like trying to find all of the places in his life, triangulating the violence in your life and then trying to like minimize that as much as he possibly can. And, there's like a certain calculus to that that's kind of like frustrating.
Mhm.
But also there's something like really admirable about it too that
Mhm.
you would actually do that type of work to really like witness to those types of evil and try to like stop doing them.
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting how Benjamin Leigh is a character who appears as capitalism is really emerging in a kind of global system. And
Yeah.
so many of the things that he sort of intuits just about his reality are not changed, right? With all the changes that have happened with capitalism, all the kind of accelerations of many of the things that he was dealing with, nevertheless, like you still have to be an abolitionist today. You should think very hard about your food production and vegetarianism probably today. You should think really hard about where your commodities come from, right? All these kinds of things are still present with us, unfortunately, even worse than they were in whatever the 18th century in many cases.
It's true. One more thing to note though too. Benjamin Leigh, I mean, he died before the emancipation of slaves, obviously. But he around the end of his life, a lot of Quakers who were previous slave owners were kind of coming around to his position. Like it was definitely like it was becoming more and more the popular decision the popular position by the end of his life. So it's like it's not like he did all this and like it didn't have any effect. Like it kind of changed Quakerism in the United States for better.
All right, let's draw a bridge then. Benjamin Leigh, very cool historical precedent, a person you should, I agree, every Christian should know about him. And we should think about maybe how to transpose some of his intuitions into our own time. But one wild thing about Christianity is there are people who keep sort of stumbling on those similar ideas. And I mentioned one of them earlier, Daniel Berrigan, and Philip Berrigan too, and lots of other people too. But Daniel Berrigan in particular is somebody I always think about, especially when I read about military budgets. I think about Daniel Berrigan. Berrigan was a Jesuit priest. He died just a few years ago. A super radical pacifist, and I wouldn't say that he was like comparable to Benjamin Leigh. They're different people in lots of different ways, but somebody who is still carrying on even that kind of performative mode of critique. So I alluded earlier, I maybe I should have paused to break it down, but I alluded to, this some radical pacifism in some cases has led people to do wild things like stealing documents, Vietnam War draft documents, and burning them in the street. So Daniel Berrigan and a number of other people, 8 other people, they had this group that came to be known as the Catonsville Nine. They stole these documents and with homemade napalm burn them. You can like look it up on YouTube and see some very cool kind of haunting images of them like praying around the burning draft documents. But that was like Daniel Berrigan's sort of approach to do these like almost these spectacular sort of protests of the war machine. This is like at the height of the Vietnam War, and then afterwards he was also a poet and really brought that sensibility into his life and political work. And a person that I think is always really inspiring. I mentioned the peace movement is probably the place where the Christian left in the U.S. and Canada had a sort of outsized role, or like it's a big gift that they have given, that our Christian community has given to the Christian left at large. Straight from the imperial core is this really strong witness against things like nuclear weapons or things like the arms trade and so on. And you even get committed pacifists like Berrigan, going to places like Vietnam to try to participate in sort of peace talks and things like that there. So I think it's really interesting to kind of just figure out where these characters pop up and what it means to sort of take that radical pacifist demand so seriously, or put your comfort and freedom at risk. And there's something about that maximal demand of pacifism that, like you said, Matt, it can lead to some like weird moral calculus that can be very frustrating and annoying and probably not a very fun way to live your life. But
Yeah.
also, as a result, it can also lead you to take other actions that other people won't take because they don't have that same kind of maximal demand. So it's an impressive thing. And, whatever my other reservations are about pacifism in a theoretical way, we could talk about that in a minute. I think it's important. It's important that tradition exists in the Christian tradition.
Yeah, I agree. The maximal demand thing, I think, is such a big part of it, right? Like, there is a type of immature pacifism that makes the maximal demand, like, it fetishizes it and makes it about purity rather
Right.
than like what it's actually supposed to be about. Like, if you kind of pick up that maximal demand and it leads you to do something, some type of direct action or even like be a vegetarian or whatever. I mean, or not, I don't know. Or make sure that you're only eating animals that like a local butcher is killed, or I don't know. However you work that kind of calculus out in your head, like whatever. I think that's fine. But like if the point is to like do it so your hands aren't dirty, particularly or something, and you kind of fetishize that as being like that's like the moral choice or whatever, it ends up getting pretty hairy, right? Like to a certain extent, like there's no because of the way that capitalism works, there's no ethical consumption for capital, right? That's like a phrase that people on the left throw around quite a bit, but it's true. Like everything with that's caught up in like the supply chain and like in the larger value chains of capital, it's like it's dirty. It's like it requires exploitation to make it. That's just kind of like the short of it, and there's nothing you can kind of do to get away from it. But to try to be a pacifist, to try to like thwart that or to kind of come out clean, that's to me like where pacifism like rubs me the wrong way, where like you have some kind of moral superiority. But like if you're taking up that maximal demand and you're trying to like do harm reduction or you're trying to do something else, I feel like I have a lot more time for that.
Yeah. Well, all right. We've said a lot of good things about pacifism, and it's great. People should keep saying good things about it, but we should also maybe talk a little bit more about some of those shortcomings, or maybe not shortcomings, but let's just say differences of opinion, to be more diplomatic. And talking about Berrigan and what you were just saying too, Matt, that kind of concern around purity, I think is a good excuse to talk about one of our other favorite priests we're always going on about on this podcast, Ernesto Cardinale. Exactly, Cardinal alert. Ernesto Cardinale was a Catholic priest who also just passed away last year in Nicaragua. He was part of the Sandinista Revolution, an incredible revolutionary priest. He became the Minister of Culture in the revolutionary government in Nicaragua. Just a lot of fascinating stuff going on there, as you might guess. Cardinal, had been in the U.S. for a while. He lived with Thomas Merton for a little bit in his abbey, and was, living a monastic life, and eventually went back to Nicaragua. So he had this kind of interesting relationship to the U.S. Catholic left, and that included Daniel Berrigan. And there was a really famous sort of exchange that Berrigan and Cardinale had. Berrigan wrote an open letter to Cardinale that was published in, I think, the National Catholic Reporter, probably, or something like that at least. And then Cardinale responded in a number of different contexts. And it's super fascinating. So what you get in Berrigan's letter is what you would probably expect, a pacifist kind of approach. I mean, he says in the letter that he sympathizes with the plight of the Nicaraguan people and so on, and I have no doubt that he does. But nevertheless, he basically delivers this kind of impassioned moral principle to say, no matter what, though, bloodshed is bad and guns are bad, and that's that, right? The revolution itself will kind of naturally corrupt everybody who's in it. Cardinale didn't like that very much as a person. Yeah, as a person who had spent time in the revolution and was now part of the government. And if you want to read something that I think is one of the coolest reflections on this conversation or debate, there's actually a really cool blog posted. It's hosted at Pax Christi USA. Pax Christi is an international nonviolent organization in the Catholic Church. The little blog here is called Father Ernesto Cardinale, Visionary Poet and Complicated Voice for Justice and Peace. It's by Dan Moriarty, who's with the Maryknollers. So it's really good. It's a perspective written by a pacifist person about Cardinale, kind of remembering his life. And I'll just read one cool little bit that he has here. So, in a speech in Germany in 1980, Ernesto Cardinale offered a poignant rebuttal. I hope even the most ardent pacifist would pause when confronted with these words. This is the editorializing. Here is Cardinale. A North American Jesuit, a friend of mine, and one of these uncompromising pacifists, wrote that no principle, however high it might be, weighs as much as the life of a single child. I answered him that I agreed with him completely, that the Sandinistas were fighting for the lives of thousands of men and women, old people and children who are murdered day by day, and that no principle, however high it might be, not even that of uncompromising pacifism, can weigh as much as the life of one of these children. And I think that sort of sums it up for me, right? Like, violence is always bad, 100%. It's never a good thing. But when we think about revolutionary situations, or when we think about what it means to live under a dictator like Somoza or something, or when we think about, real history of people taking up arms, making that extremely difficult and challenging decision to do that in a country like Nicaragua, it at least encourages us to, I think, widen our scope a bit and try to eschew those positions of purity, and just try to, sympathize with what Cardinale is saying. It's like, on behalf of the fact that children shouldn't have to lose their lives, sometimes people are, driven to take actions that are not the direct actions that Daniel Berrigan took, something bigger, riskier, and maybe even a temptation. And I think it's important to sort of leave that door open, as complicated as that conversation is.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, you have to think like, well, what's the alternative, right? In those moments, if the alternative is to live under a dictatorship, I don't know. It makes sense, right? I don't know. I'm not like recommending violence or whatever in any way, but like, I mean, I agree with Cardinal. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I often think, like, I'm not a very violent person by disposition. I would not be of any use in a violent situation. I wouldn't make a good draftee for anybody, including people I agree with or whatever. It's just not really in my nature. But at the same time, it's like, I think maybe that's one reason I appreciate CPT so much, right? It's like, it's a sort of recognition that these are people who are like, well, we're not really going to do the violent side of it, but we're not going to take this kind of approach that Berrigan took to Cardinale, which is to, get up from a certain pulpit and preach to somebody in the middle of a revolutionary situation in a global South country and sort of presume that the moral principle kind of speaks for itself almost, which is what Berrigan sort of does. And yeah, it's important to see, peace is such a complicated word because, of course, peace is, it's a way of life for sure and all that kind of stuff. But peace is also the achievement, the result of lots of processes, right? You can't really have peace under a dictatorship. It's hard to live a life of peace under a dictatorship and so on. And again, when people make that extremely difficult decision to take up arms, it's important, too, to recognize that they may very well be doing that for the sake of peace, not as a betrayal of peace. And that's an important thing to just kind of keep in our brains, especially when we talk about people who are far more oppressed than we might be.
Yeah, totally. As we've been thinking through it, I've been thinking a little bit about a phrase that you hear in the labor movement every now and again. It's kind of I guess, sort of an old timey phrase, but you still hear it quite a bit. The term is labor peace. So when if you're in a union and you have a contract, in your contract there is, I mean, I would imagine for 99% of people, I don't know, maybe everybody, I really don't know. There's what's called a no strike clause, where if as long as your contract is existing, is before it's it's not expired or whatever, you agreed not to go on strike. There's a piece because you've come to an agreement and like everyone sort of achieved what they wanted in the contract, or not really, but you've come to things that you can kind of like live with. So anyways, it's that's the feeling that I guess I'm thinking through when we're talking about peace. It's like, well, it is sort of like a struggle. It's a negotiation. It is maybe tense at some points. Maybe there's even like an end to it sometime in the future. Who knows? But it's also just like it's a moment where no one's gonna lash out immediately. But it's sort of a hard won, negotiated type of situation.
Yeah, I think that's good, right? And again, just seeing peace as something you have to work for, and yeah, something that might also at some point require you to go on strike if you want to maintain that peace or get it back. All those kind of complicated pieces. Um, it reminds me too. I've been reading a bunch of stuff in just Catholic social teaching lately for lots of different practical reasons in my life, and I was rereading Fratelli Tutti recently, Pope Francis's encyclical from last year, and I came across this really good passage where he says, "We can aspire to a world that provides land, housing, and work for all. This is the true path of peace, not the senseless and myopic strategy of sowing fear and mistrust in the face of outside threats. For a real and lasting peace will only be possible on the basis of a global ethic of solidarity and cooperation in the service of a future shaped by interdependence and shared responsibility in the whole human family." And the short of it, I think, is, a world that has land, housing, and work for all, that is a peaceful world. And I think that really changes the game, right? Like, peace isn't just a demand of like being nice to other people, which is what I think the kind of trendy hipster Christian pacifists often think, right? If you're like upset, then you're not doing it right or something. But rather, peace is this the social consequence, right? Another thing that kind of comes out elsewhere in Catholic social teaching is that peace isn't the absence of warfare. It's the result of lots of hard work that people do every single day to try to create a more just society. Or like Pope Paul VI had this famous phrase where he said, "If you want peace, work for justice." So I think also just kind of framing peace in that way helps to avoid the moralism parts a little, which is to say, peace is a horizon that we're working toward. And anytime you're working toward a horizon, you're going to have to make compromises or think very strategically and carefully about how to get there. And when you start thinking in those terms, I think it's sort of a more it's hard to figure out the right adjective. Like, the words I don't want to use, but kind of I'm like circling around in my head, are terms like it's a more mature way of thinking, or like a more sophisticated way of thinking. I don't want to say those things because I don't think that like pacifists are immature or like simple or not sophisticated, but it's just to say that there's something about that kind of bigger sense of peace that can, I don't know, get us further. And I should say too, pacifists, I think, also have that idea that peace is an achievement, right? Like, sophisticated pacifists have that idea. But in terms of the means that might get to that end, it's important to, recognize that there are, unfortunately, times when the path to peace looks like a bigger compromise in some places than others. I guess I could put it that way.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, when all of society is sort of predicated on the struggle of class against class, a real easy peace is not something you're going to be able to come by.
Right.
You have to find ways to resolve those contradictions, and I don't know. It's not always going to be like people talking at a table nicely, I suppose.
Yeah. And, like I said, it's I think that pacifists and non-pacifists can actually travel very, very far together on that path, sort of thinking of peace as an achievement and the result of land, housing, and work. There's obviously pacifists have been some of the strongest people in the history of the world, also fighting for those very things, right? So I think it's important to see that. And maybe it's important that pacifists exist too, and that we have this bigger conversation about peace, because there are people on the left who like fetishize violence in a really weird way, even like a moralistic way, where they'll be like, you have to be violent at some point or else you're like not hardcore enough. And I think that is stupid and also extremely dangerous. You're not going to get anywhere with those kinds of ideas.
Not only is it stupid and dangerous, it's also just like uncreative, I think.
Yeah.
Like, well, I mean, like a minute ago, I just said, like, if your entire society is predicated on class war, you have to resolve those conflicts. And, like, that's true, but like, it doesn't necessarily mean, it means whatever the historical conditions it means. It's like whatever the situation kind of calls for, I guess. But like, I don't know, thinking that it has to be like the Bolshevik Revolution or whatever is like wrong-headed.
Or thinking that you could even pull that off in 2021 in the United States when the U.S. just passed a like $778 billion military budget. Like, I'm sorry, it is not Tsarist Russia.
That's true. Or it's always like really bizarre too when like I don't know. This is something I think I've talked about this on the podcast before, but like um Luce Arce, he won in Bolivia, and like, you know, Mas is back in power in Bolivia or whatever, and then people on the internet were like, okay, great. So now they have a socialist president again, and like, when does the protracted People's War start? And it's like,
right.
hopefully never.
Yeah,
Like, what are you
exactly.
talking about?
Yeah.
Just like, you know, a weird assumption that there's like a weird progress narrative that like has to be sort of fulfilled before you can kind of like resolve class struggle.
Right.
I mean, you know, that's in Marxism for sure, and there's like some problems with that as well. But it's just like thinking that you have to resolve it in this like this way where these particular types of struggles with really violent characteristics are always necessary is just like a very bizarre way to live your life.
Yeah, I mean, Marx himself was open to the possibility of a nonviolent way to achieve socialism. He was not optimistic about it, for sure, but he made some allowances for it in his writing, especially in his late writing. And the whole thing of it was, for Marx, is the labor movement developed enough to do this, to pull it off through parliamentary processes or you know, other peaceful means? And Marx's thoughts were, I guess, if you can do it, you should do it, you know, like try to do that if you can do that. But Marx just had this kind of recognition that, you know, once people start getting power, usually people in power don't want to just kind of hand that over out of the goodness of their hearts or because they see, you know, the writing on the wall, right? That is not typically how it goes, even though it would be preferable. So it's just kind of an awareness, I guess, of history in that way.
It's true. I mean, yeah, I mean, Marx says that, and I think he's right. And then, like, you know, if you look at the history of Latin America, you see how these things can play out in a whole bunch of different ways too, right? Like violent and non-violent alike. So I guess all that to say, there's no set course for how history has to be or what the struggle for socialism has to look like. But there are certainly better and worse ways to think about the end goal of peace, for sure.
Yeah. All right, so it's the Advent Week of Peace. Let's see, where did we get? We were talking about pacifism. We got through a couple of pacifist heroes, and now here we're at the end talking about peace. I think, I don't know, for me, the thing I've been thinking about this whole week has really just been that structural piece, land, housing, and work. I think, you know, Pope Francis, he's not going to come out and say that we should have a socialist church or whatever, but I don't know how you get land, housing, and work for all under capitalism. I think you, by definition, can't do it. So it's really important to recognize that if we want peace, we have to work for a just economic structure that is not going to be a capitalist one, right? Socialism looks different in lots of different parts of the world. It will look different in the United States and Canada than it does in whatever, Cuba or Kerala, India, or wherever else, but it has to look like land, housing, and work for all somehow, and that is the path to peace, I think, right? It's not just sort of being nice to people, not just being like Jesus didn't take sides or Jesus, you know, doesn't like people getting riled up about military budgets or something. On the contrary, it means you have to really commit yourself to, you know, to doing that. Whether that means supporting the labor movement, supporting tenant associations, supporting whatever, peasant associations abroad, however that looks. It's really important to, or land defense in Canada and the U.S. even, right? It's important to kind of look for those opportunities to see the path of peace as a path of a social transformation, I guess.
There you go. That's great.
All right, sure.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/themagnificast. That was my quickest ever outro, I think. But now I'm going to slow it down. I'm going to slow it down a little bit now to tell you that supporting us on Patreon is really great. If you do it, you can get an invite to our cool Discord channel. You can get the behind the paywall podcast called The Lock-In that we do sometimes, but we've been a little bit lax on it lately because of travel and holidays and whatnot, but it's coming. Just hang on. Cool. So you could do that. Or if you don't have money to do that, that's fine. Don't. That's okay. It's an option. And it's fine. Not a big deal. Cool. Well, let me slow it way down now to tell you that our intro music is by Mario Armstrong and our outro music is by The Illogical Spoon, and we'll see you next time.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. At least I would have